everyone. Today we have our another new episode, and this episode is very important because we have our world famous speaker, Professor Fred Philip from Tando, Professor Rob, and Professor David Schumacher from Transhumanist Party. We will discuss about decent work and economic growth. This is very important, especially after the COVID. There are a lot of economical challenges, even though maybe we can discuss some points about European conflicts. And most important thing is that all of the speakers they're gonna offer very good solution for our human developments. So first I want to give chance Professor Fred Philip.
Oh, thank you, Sharif. The juniper trees are here, and so it's high allergy season in New Mexico. And if I break out in coughing and sneezing, please bear with me. And when we think of defining work,
it's 8 o'clock.
I think we mean work that does not expose employees to toxic chemicals, to radioactives, to particulates like coal dust, that doesn't involve stoop labor, working in strawberry fields, and the like. It's beginning to be more possible thanks to robotics, and I'll get back to robots in a moment, but it's not always possible to replace all those dirty jobs that are performed by humans. Decent work also means work that needs to be done, not work that exists just to subjugate the kinds of people who are the workers. Before, you know that along with the pandemic, there was something called the Great Resignation, when, at least here in the United States, massive numbers, unprecedented numbers of people were quitting their jobs, possibly because they didn't want to catch COVID at work and go home and infect grandma and the young children. But you know, for other reasons, people realize life is short and they don't need to take the crap that was handed out by the bosses. And in fact, before the pandemic, surveys showed that the foremost reasons that people quit jobs, and before the pandemic, people quit jobs often to go to another job, which was not the case in the pandemic, when people would quit in order to. But the foremost reason people quit jobs prior to the pandemic was toxic bosses. They quit the job because they couldn't stand the boss. And bosses who are insecure about their own capabilities often try to compensate and shore up their self-esteem by needlessly dominating the people who work for them. So this is what I mean by work that needs to be done rather than work that exists just to subjugate other people. There's no reason for a boss to tell someone with an employee with a graduate degree to go fetch the coffee. And that's just a very mild example. So we have a lot of things to fix to make work decent. I want to make a distinction between work that's decent and work that's fulfilling. You know, someone may feel fulfilled working a very boring job that is sufficient to feed their family. That might offer a sense of personal fulfillment, but the government and the corporations cannot offer fulfilling jobs because fulfillment is a matter of personal choice, personal psychology on the part of the employee. So we can strive to offer decent work. We can't strive to offer fulfilling work, as nice as that might be. Now, decent work also means enough pay so that we have a terrible situation here in the United States where workers who work behind the counter at McDonald's can't make enough money, are not paid enough uh, to rise above the level that no longer qualifies for government assistance. So the government pays the employees of McDonald's, call them food stamps, and it is a very unattractive government subsidy to companies that pay uh, substandard wages to the employees. And of course, decent work would also mean paying enough so that workers can live close enough to work that they don't spend hours and much of their income on commuting. Okay, let me shift topics for a moment and talk about robots. It turns out that robots, to the extent that they're taking over jobs, are taking over jobs that are mainly the boring and repetitive jobs. The papers on robotics that were presented at the recent AAAS conference revealed that the robots are very efficient now at repetitive jobs, but they are not versatile at all. And so there are a great many jobs that low-level jobs, we call them, but still jobs that require judgment and flexibility that the robots cannot take over. But, it turns out that companies using more robots are actually increasing their human employment level. And I wonder whether that will last. Economic theorists are telling us that robots are making companies more efficient and therefore able to expand their operations and hire more people. This sounds suspicious to me, an economic theorist's desperate attempt to make the theory persist. But to the extent that robots replace human jobs, people, of course, economists who like substitution effects, they're saying, okay, well, we train these people to become robot technicians. Okay, but not every janitor in the world, not every cleaning person in the world is ready, either by temperament or by intellectual capacity, to be trained to become a robot technician. And who is going to pay for the training? This is one of the unanswered questions. So now we turn to fairness and the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, one of the Sustainable Development Goals is decent work for everybody. But there are also a great many environmental-oriented Sustainable Development Goals and much discussion of fairness. I don't think it can last because we have to, of all the SDGs, we have to give priority to keeping this planet's environment cordial to human life. And, if we fail to do that and all of us die, then of course that's fair. It hasn't given preferential life to anybody, but we have to give priority to the environmental goals. It won't be fair for everybody. I have to say that I'm willing to take my hit. I'm willing to endure quite a bit of inconvenience if we can save the earth for our children and grandchildren. And I think we have to plan with that in mind. And then the final. Yeah, we want to raise the average local wealth everywhere without sacrificing the quality of life, and without perpetuating too much economic inequity. This is difficult. We all know by now that the gross domestic product is a terrible measure. It's harmful. It measures the wrong things entirely and allows too many negative environmental externalities. But nobody's thought of anything better. And local economic development people continue to try to bring more companies in, no matter what kinds of jobs they bring, and issue building permits for ticky-tacky housing developments to take over the land. And we really do need to redefine our ideas of economic development. I think actually this session is called economic growth rather than economic development. So the same comments about GDP apply. And um, the rate of growth of the Earth's population is leveling off. Okay, the population is still growing, but it's not growing as fast as it used to. And all the economic growth theories depend on more and more people, and we will have to reevaluate everything when it comes to economic growth. So not to take up too much time, let me stop here, and thanks for letting me lead.
Okay, thank you, Professor Fred Philip. Now I request uh, Professor Rob. Professor Rob.
Good morning. Thank you. Decent work is kind of an interesting term. It's not one that I've used a great deal. It's got some formal definitions. It means opportunities for everyone to get work that is productive and delivers a fair income, security in the workplace, and social protection for families, better prospects for personal development and social integration. It is also important that all women and men are given equal opportunities in the workplace. Decent work sums up the aspirations of people in their working lives. It involves opportunities for work that is productive and delivers a fair income, security in the workplace, and social protection for families, better prospects for personal development and social integration, freedom for people to express their concerns, organize and participate in decisions that affect their lives, and equality of opportunity and treatment for all men and women. So the common elements are equality between men and women, and a more inclusive experience with the employer and the work product, in that it enhances their family, enhances their ability for personal development and progression. So the kinds of things that wouldn't be decent work, as Fred pointed out, would be things like mining, relatively unsafe jobs because they would not contribute to the family, and certainly put the employer at risk, and become an ideal place for robots. In fact, one of the interesting things with regard to robotics is the very different strategies companies have in terms of deploying them, and where they've not been very successful. We had an experiment about 6 years ago for an inexpensive human-like a robot. I think it cost about $22,000. That could be put in place of an assembly line worker, and at $22,000, the robots were too expensive, and the effort failed, showcasing rather dramatically that assembly workers are way too underpaid, and because there shouldn't really be a situation where a repetitive job could be more cheaply done by a human, unless a lot of the costs of that labor are not taken into account. And certainly repetitive jobs have health costs, mental costs, and others that go towards that effort. The other recurring theme, of course, is equality between men and women, and probably that intrinsically includes equalities between races, no racial discrimination, etc. The issue, as it exists here in the United States, is men and women are not paid equally. But the problem of correcting that issue is that if you bring down male workers' salaries to increase female workers' salaries, you will get a net loss in productivity. The women won't work harder; the men will work less hard. And so in coming to that equality of salary, the only thing that makes sense if you want to assure productivity is leaving the men's salaries in place and uplifting the women's salaries. But given where margins are, that for a lot of companies is not something that they can do and remain profitable. So there's a hard issue with regard to the problem of inequality in between salaries, addressing that problem and assuring economic stability, let alone economic growth. So it is hoped that automation at some point will allow us to force that function by removing a lot of the salary load by replacing those people with automation and robotics, and by freeing that money up, then paying that money to women and allowing salary equality to emerge. Given I've not seen a single workable plan to make that happen, I have my doubts it will. So the end result is as we try to get to decent work, and I believe it is a valid goal, to really think through the broad aspect of employment as opposed to the narrow aspect and assure equality, is that the economics work against solving the problem as we are currently constructed. And to go into more depth, both Hertzberg and Maslow wrote about the impact of money on motivation and productivity, and found that money makes a really lousy motivator. It's not effective at all in getting people to work harder. Where it is very effective is when there's inequality or somebody feels they're being taken advantage of. It can dramatically reduce their productivity, which is why I mentioned that the models show that if you reduce the male salary to improve the female salary, the female gets more money, but she's probably already working maxed out. And the guy's going to be pissed, and that's going to adversely impact their work product. It's an unfortunate problem that probably should never have existed, and only existed because there was a separation of duties between men and women, largely up through the 70s, where women were expected to stay at home and men were expected to work, and so that the inequality was justified by assuming, since the men were breadwinners and the women were not, that men deserved more money. The error in logic is that money should be equated to the job product. It shouldn't be equated to the choices, the personal choices the employee makes between getting married and having kids and not. Those choices should be their own and shouldn't be compensated or penalized by the company. And so that early mistake carried through, and certainly even in those early days, it had an adverse impact on women that were single, particularly women that were single and raising children, because they were not adjusted for their loads, and men that were single didn't have children got the benefit but didn't enjoy the cost. And so, in a very weird way, the economic decisions companies were making were not working for society as a whole, which wants couples to get married, have kids, and broaden the population. So all in all, a focus on a decent work early on would have solved a great number of the problems we're dealing with today, and likely we'll be dealing with for the future. I should point out that when I first joined the major workforce in the technology market, I went to work for IBM. In the old days, companies actually, at least with regard to male employees, we've already talked about the lack of fairness between men and women. But the company was kind of like your family. They assured a pension in your retirement. They had events that you were required to attend that were social in nature, that assured your interaction and your social well-being. And IBM took a great deal of interest in your personal life, even down to the point where they monitored things like substance abuse and worked not to fire you if you had a problem, but worked to get you help. It was much more comprehensive. Medical was paid by the employer and was very good. So that the idea, of course, at the time was so that you were very loyal to the employer, and that turnover was reduced, and it worked very well. Only one company was successful being able to pull out IBM employees. Oh, I should point out that on average, IBM employees were paid less than employees in other companies that didn't have those benefits. That extra money, of course, went to supplying those benefits, so it's much more comprehensive. So employee turnover up through the 80s in IBM was very low. You couldn't pull employees out. Then in the early 90s, IBM collapsed those programs, became kind of a less of a work for life a company, and become more like other firms, and their turnover spiked. First they had layoffs, which certainly didn't help anything, but then their turnover went up dramatically, and the movement in and out of IBM is much more normalized now, which is a problem because retaining employees and lowering turnover does make you more efficient, and the though it can lead to and this is what took IBM down, it can lead to a certain amount of inbreeding inside the company and a lack of new ideas and an isolation of the executive staff, which were all I wrote the paper on this. So but all contributed to IBM's fall. So back to decent work. It should be a part of every company's culture. It is not. It is more the exception than the rule, and that makes fixing an awful lot of problems that otherwise wouldn't exist problematic. But it still remains a goal. And as you look for jobs and you go into the workplace, looking at more at the quality of the space, the social interaction, the way the company treats its employees, the frequency of layoffs, those should all be critical parts of your job search to make sure that the extra stress the company may put on you is minimalized and that you can focus on the job that you like. Decent work, by the way, does not address at all whether the job is right for you. It just addresses whether the job and the employer is more encompassing and more engaged with your social development and with salary and benefit equity. So it implies a good company, but it still puts the onus on the employee to make sure that the job is right for them. And I honestly think as we go through our education process, we should be doing a lot more to help kids find the careers that they would most enjoy, as well as looking for the companies that are much more nurturing and much less hostile to employees. By example, and in contrast, the two companies in the United States that are cross purposes on this is Apple pays extremely well, is extremely hard on employees, one of the worst cultures in the business. So bad that if you leave IBM, they change your title to associate, so that if you're doing a job search or a background search, whatever titles you had look false and they're not validated by Apple. And this is one of their anti-employee practices. On the other hand, you go over to a company like Cisco or HP, they treat their employees like family. It's a much warmer environment, and they really care what happens to the employees and happens to the world as a whole. You can make more at Apple. You will probably find a much more rewarding career at the other two, and your choices will define you and define your career. So it's something to be aware of, and this, I agree, this is a very important topic we don't talk about enough.
Thank you. Mr. David Schumacher. Mr. David.
Yes, hello, Sharif. Hello, everyone. I appreciate the opening remarks from Fred and Rob both. I want to build on parts of what they had to say. First off, I want to thank Rob for the definition on decent work. And I saw a definition that was like that or very similar to that in the UN Sustainable Goals, which decent work was number 8 in that particular list. And as I read the list, I think, yes, these are things that we need to do. And as I read number 8 on decent work, I look at that and I see terms in there like fair income and social protection and better prospects for individual development and social integration. As I say, I definitely agree with those, but they all seem very, very subjective to me. And that's okay, but we have to have a conversation around what each of those mean so that we're all pulling for the same thing. So that's a subjective aspect of it. Now, I said this was part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So I looked up what they mean by sustainable development. And primarily it comes back to what most people, I think, define sustainable development. Fred mentioned GDP, for example, but it's more of a quantitative way of looking at things. So you have subjective on one hand and you have quantitative on the other hand, and you need discussions about both so that you can chart a course to go someplace. For example, some people propose adding to GDP labor compensation, business profits, other sources of income along with GDP, and calling that gross domestic income. That's another way to look at this that might be more inclusive to the society. Whatever method we come up with to analyze the quantitative matters of growth, those are the things that are going to be emphasized by actions, because once we define something and set a goal, people will work towards that, but may not actually solve the fundamental problem, but they will find a way to satisfy that goal. That's something that we have probably all have seen in our business lives doing any type of work where you're going to report your metrics and show some type of improvement. So we have quantitative, and we have which can be objective, and then we have the qualitative aspects of this. Now, what this comes down to, I think, is looking at what are the underlying values that are underneath. I think Rob did a pretty good job of explaining the different values between Apple and HP, for example. Is there a way to reconcile those, bring those together? And I think it comes down to the individual employees, as he said. Where do you choose to go? Do you choose to take the money? Do you choose to take the better environment? Or are there other options where perhaps you can get some of each that fits you better? But it all comes back down to values. Now, when Sharif introduced me earlier, he mentioned that I was with the Transhumanist Party. So I want to put out the 3 core values of the Transhumanist Party as an option for how these values can be determined. So the first core value is healthy, long life. How do these goals of decent work and economic growth relate to healthy, long life? The second goal is solving problems by the use of rational and reasoned solutions. Is there a way that we can do that? And then the third one, which is very much in the news these days, which is reduction of existential risk. So whether that's a war in Europe, whether that's a war in Central America, whether that's the war on COVID, all of these things come into play. How do we address those issues? So COVID is an example of where we had to look at minimizing risk for individuals as they go to work. Some people could work from home, some could not. We had essential workers. There was a lot of moving pieces to managing the risks in the COVID environment. And this all goes back to the notion of decent work. Too often, many of the jobs that could not be done remotely were many of perhaps the lower paying jobs where people had to go in and risk exposure to COVID versus people like myself, which could work from home and isolate myself pretty much the way I wanted. So all these things need to be looked at in the context of society broadly. But I think we get opportunities, if you will, when we have challenges like the COVID that we've spent the last couple of years in, and as wars come up, because those things have to be managed as well. Take a look at what 2 million refugees pouring into Eastern European countries is going to do as far as work environment. You're going to have people that are going to be searching for economic security that maybe don't speak the language, don't have the customs. All of this comes into play as well. And then how do you measure overall society on how they are handling that and maintaining their own populations, and how is the rest of the world supporting that? So what I'm trying to say, and I think I've heard elements of this in the previous 2 talks, is it really comes down to what our ethical treatment is as far as we go forward and address this. And it doesn't have to be abstract, but it will be subjective and it will be objective, and it's up to us to determine how we measure those, what we incentivize, and how we move forward on this. So I'll have more to say about robots later, I think, too, perhaps. That's an interesting subject as well, and one of my favorites. But that's where I want to leave it for now.
Thank you, Mr. Paul.
Was working in the coal mines, those pictures of, or chimney sweeps, in the UK, when we're burning coal, to send up the kid up into the chimney to clean it out. We've come a long way from that, but there's still loads of things that we're doing wrong. I mean, the metrics for measuring economic productivity, of course, are, they're really skewed. To economists, if there's not constant growth, there's a problem. And, as human society has developed, we've generally had population growth, 1% or 1.5% per year, continuous exponential population growth. And this, of course, makes it easy to have economic growth. Because you have larger and larger labor forces, larger and larger people consuming, etc. But as populations sort of stabilize, many countries have turned to huge immigration in order to maintain the growth in those countries. But the metric is not; it doesn't take into account the individual well-being of people, happiness. So ideas about using things like gross domestic happiness and some other metrics are very important to see what's going on. And people generally, if they feel stressed all of the time financially, then they don't make good workers. They're not they're not high productivity people. So the ideas of guaranteed minimum income have been thrown around, and there's been some trials taken with that sort of thing. And there's various pros and cons of those sort of things. I mean, some people say that it just makes people lazier, and other people say, well, it takes the financial stress of paying for food and a roof over your heads away. Allowing you to be, follow your passions, whether it be art or, hobbies or whatever, or things, and art, of course, is very important to culture. It's often because there's not metrics associated with it being, a productivity thing. It's often sort of neglected. And I think Winston Churchill said, he was a big supporter of the arts even during World War II. He said, if you don't support the arts, what's the point of even fighting, right? If you don't care about your culture. Many countries, Nordic countries, seem to be doing the right thing. They have good levels of happiness. As it's measured by various metrics. Finland, supposedly the happiest country in the world, and some of these northern countries, of course, they get very little sunlight during the winter months, yet their population seems to survive and do just fine. So, there's like they adapt. I mean, country like when I was in Norway a few years ago, the entire country basically shuts down for August or parts of July and August because they don't get much summer, and that's the month of summer that they get. So the country basically caters to the people there, and basically everything kind of stops, and people are perfectly happy. They take all their vacation, at that time of the year, sort of en masse. Now, the war has been mentioned a bit. There's an old Russian saying, we will pretend to work and you will pretend to pay us, in terms of, work there. And, there's loads of jobs right now in the Ukraine. I mean, they're dying to get people, to go there. If your bucket list involves destroying a heavy tank, for example, with a Molotov cocktail, now is the time in the Ukraine. And what's interesting is they're using capitalism to try to, get a strategic advantage against the Russians. For example, I just heard today that the Ukrainians will pay $1 million to any Russian pilot who brings them an intact fighter, a MiG or something. If you're Russian, making about the equivalent of about $600 or $700 a year for your work in the Russian military, you can take your plane and land it on, and give it to the Ukrainians and get $1 million. So there's huge financial incentives for, put out by Ukraine to get Russians to switch sides or give them equipment. I think it's $50,000 is the going rate for a soldier who basically puts down their arms and surrenders or stops fighting. $100,000 if they bring a functioning tank or fuel vehicle to the Ukraine. So it's actually quite an interesting idea, which using the idea of work or providing money to the opponents that you're fighting in a war. And of course, there are, I've seen job ads just in the last few days. Of course, they're memes, but they're looking for people at the Chernobyl nuclear site, for example, because its power is being cut off, electrical power, and they still want to circulate the cooling water so that there's no radiation leaks, et cetera. So they're looking for people to operate hand pumps to keep the water circulating through the reactor. I think, of course, that's a joke, but it's interesting how they're being very sort of creative. And I should point out that, people in the Ukrainian, all aspects, all different jobs, elements across all of society, at this particular time, they're giving up their regular work and they're joining the military to defend their country. So we're talking about Olympic, weightlifters and boxers, and even one of the top ballerinas in the world has taken up arms. And so it's interesting that when there's a time of great need and great conflict, people are very willing to take different roles in society. So take different jobs if you like to deal with the bigger issues. So it's just an interesting way of looking at ways to motivate people, because it's been mentioned, of course, that money is not a huge factor in the motivation and happiness of employees. It's how you treat people. It's the challenge of the work. It's how and this great resignation of people. I guess people that have been sort of in the so-called rat race, feel like they're on the wheel, the circular wheel that the rat runs around and spins. When there's a existential threat like the virus, worldwide threat, people really reevaluate what they're doing, and this is probably the main reason for this sort of mass resignation. People that have been, people tend to be creatures of habit. So if you're doing something, even if it's awful for you and boring, et cetera, if it brings in some money that pays for the bills, people can do that for years and years and years. In fact, in their entire lives. I mean, I look back at what my dad was a draftsman, and he came to Canada in 1956, and he basically had the one job his whole life, and people tended to do that, not too long ago. But now I think the average time that people spend at a particular job is a year or two. It's a very, very short period of time. There's an awful lot of job hopping. Some of it is due to people trying to find opportunities elsewhere. Some of it is due to the human psychology of thinking that the grass is always greener somewhere else. There's lots of different reasons for this, but it's interesting that I've heard of programs for people coming out of school where they go to a company for just a few months, and then they go to another company and another company, and then after a year or two, they know exactly what they want to do, and they can find a job that is much more suitable to them, that they'll be much happier doing because they've had the experience of trying a bunch of different things and seeing what they don't like. Sometimes knowing what you don't like is a lot easier than knowing what you like and what you ultimately want to do. And there's an awful lot of pressure on young people to sort of hop into the career or the thing or their follow their passion and hit it off right at the very beginning, without making errors. But we don't operate that way. I mean, humans don't operate that way. I mean, when you're a baby trying to walk, I mean, you don't instantly start walking. You bump into things, you fall, you hurt yourself. You figure out what to do eventually by trial and error. And why should we expect people to leave school and know immediately what they want to do? And also, there's the idea of, we need to really look at the role that volunteerism plays in the workforce, because often, companies take interns or people and they pay them next to nothing. And the student will get some credit with the school. So the university has some contracts with companies, and basically, if the students aren't paid a fair wage for what they're doing, it's almost like, slave labor. I mean, it does nothing for the student, really. I mean, it's, but then there's other things where people really do passionately want to volunteer, and love doing what they're doing. So, volunteerism is important, but it can be, abused by companies wanting people to do stuff for them for free. So there's all of these different aspects. If when there is a crisis like COVID, a global pandemic, if people, what it's done basically is it's really, made people think about their lives and, given them a sense that there's impermanence, in whatever they're doing, right? That you don't live forever, and, you should try to find things that you enjoy doing, which also, pay the bills, et cetera. I mean, the Japanese have a lot of different models to, deal with the sort of work-life balance. And I think, as I mentioned, the Scandinavian countries, they seem to be doing a very good job at finding this balance between the work life and their home life and personal lives, et cetera.
Thank you. Thank you for your excellent analysis. I want to go for the concluding remarks because two of our speakers, maybe they have appointment. So Professor Fred Philip, what's your concluding remarks for today's session? But if you can add some point, I believe number one, these Ukraine issues, number two, robotics, and number three, what kind of economic strategy we can take in this COVID-19 situation.
Well, sure. Robots are doing a great number of beneficial things, from de-icing airplane wings to operating in radioactive environments, jobs that are unpleasant and dangerous. I think there'll be huge growth of robotics in orbital and outer space environments. And of course, that's great because we can't all qualify to be astronauts. So let's send the robots. I really want to pick up on what Rob said about the systemic, looking at this more systemically, and whether a decent job is beneficial to society. When I talked about jobs that are deliberately designed to be humiliating just to shore up the self-images of the bosses, of course I had race in mind. I didn't mention it explicitly, but this is one area, as well as the men and women area where the concept of decent jobs has to be considered. I spent a number of years living in Korea, and that experience really illustrates how we have to think of this more systemically than just the employer-employee relationship. Um, a great thing about Korea is that there are basically totally equal educational opportunities for men and women. Um, and the women are tend to be more interested in foreign language study, and so they become very attractive employees because, on the unfortunate side, in Korea, women are still paid less than men for equivalent job. All right, so now let's talk systemically. You know that the country has a huge population. I forget what it is, in a country the size of Ohio, and real estate costs are astronomical. And young people don't want to get married until they can afford a place to live. So here we have many employment opportunities, good career opportunities for women, and the women don't want to date boys who are living with their parents at home and without a job. All right. So talk about the leveling off of population growth. That feeds back to that, and women are flocking from the countryside to the cities for these career opportunities. And Korean men back in the rural areas on the farm are importing wives, that's a crude way to say it, from Vietnam and elsewhere. And, it's the jobs are very decent for the women, but it's not optimal for society. And we don't know this unless we look at the situation in a wider scope than simply the employer-employee relationship. We talked about gross domestic product, gross national happiness. As long as we hew to these quantitative measures that measure the wrong things, it's very much like that old joke about the drunk who dropped his keys on the dark street corner, and somebody asks why he's looking for them under the street lamp, and the drunk says, because the light is better here. This is what the way that these quantitative measures mislead us. And so what we really need to do, as Paul and others said, is emphasize, and I don't know how we'll disseminate this idea more strongly, emphasize ethics and human goodwill because they have to supplement any quantitative measures of economic well-being that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Support, for all of your support. You always guide us. We always help us. That is the way, especially many youth community, even before the session, we train many youth communities. Uh, they want support from World Talent Economy Forum. I believe Professor Fred Philip, Professor Rob, Professor David Schumacher, Professor Pauls, all of our speakers, they are happy to support any of our youth with your research idea, with your startup idea. Even many developing nations, they are collaborating with us. Even in Malaysia, some largest NGO from Malaysia, Singapore, Bangladesh, and they are also working with start working with us, especially our objective. We want to develop a knowledge based communities. That is the problem of developing nations, especially we need to develop more research programs. We need to develop more startup ecosystems. And I know that our major problem that we need more expert. So definitely all of our speakers gonna support us. So thank you for all of your support, Professor Fred Philip. Professor Rob, what's your concluding remarks for today?
Well, we don't really talk enough about decent work. The level of inequality that exists in almost every environment is exceedingly high, and the focus on monetary compensation and an away from work-health balance is abysmally low. That's been one of the problems with regard to the pandemic, is that while productivity has remained high, and so has compensation, at least in the areas where it wasn't already suffering. Work-life balance has dropped off the map, and that offset has created a potential future problem for a lot of companies, which we've talked about in terms of the Great Resignation. And the kinds of things that are driving people to change jobs, the one we're not really talking about is the fact that while they've been working at home, they lost the social construct of the company. Often people are loyal to other people, their friends, their coworkers, even their manager. And as they've been working from home, that loyalty is eroded. They're no longer having lunch or doing social events with those people. Many of the folks have moved away from where their company is, and they can't get together anymore. And there's only so much video conferencing products can provide. And even though we've kind of renamed that product class collaboration products, it hasn't fixed the underlying issues with the fact that people don't like to collaborate as a group. There certainly are exceptions, and the tools don't really assist with collaboration for the most part. What they do is they just virtualize meetings, which for a lot of us were counterproductive, not productive in the first place. And you just got more meetings, and when you're in meetings, you're not actually doing your work job, which means that a lot of people are working much longer hours as a result to make up for the meetings that are taking up their time. Plus, now they're home, they have home responsibilities. Their kids are at home too. They have to watch them. Pets are a distraction, and the ability for a lot of people to even maintain productivity at home because they haven't had to learn those skills in the past has been problematic. It's just very easy for them to be distracted and not get stuff done, which puts their jobs at risk, and that job risk now makes their desire to stay in the job much less than it was. And so the idea of decent work, this idea of work is much more of a social construct, something where you focus on fairness and the overall wellness of the individual, is incredibly important, and something that the industry was well focused on up through the 1970s, where in the U.S. they created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and pretty much drove everything that those of us working on manpower management, which is my middle degree, we're trying to accomplish with regard to putting people in the jobs that they would find the most rewarding, looking for productivity, ways to enhance productivity while assuring a work-life balance. All that stuff went bye-bye with a forcing function on equality, when the underlying problem for equality wasn't racism in and of itself. It was a lack of educational equality coming up. The tools that were being used were rightly showcasing that minorities didn't have the right training, and the way to fix that was not to force balance at the hiring stage, but to force balance at the education stage first, so that the candidates were equally qualified, and then assure a lack of discrimination, not do the discrimination first and pretty much ignore the whole education problem. So looking at this holistically and back to what you can do as students is once again, the kinds of things you need to be looking at is what's the culture of the company? How do they treat their employees? How often do they do stupid things like layoffs? And when I say layoffs are generally stupid, that layoffs generally result from bad decisions made by management, and they have a great deal of collateral damage associated with them because they break working teams, they break customer relationships, and it's kind of like a triage in medical terms, where you've got too few doctors and too many patients, and so the doctors are having to make very rapid decisions across large populations and often doing as much damage as they're doing good because they can't spend the time to do a quality job. A layoff does much the same thing. It's just slicing off parts of a company without a whole lot of concern with the collateral damage. And that IBM layoff I mentioned earlier, when we first did that, we lost a number of our most profitable lines because the people we laid off were critical to actually building the products, and with them gone, we couldn't do it. That was kind of the end result of bringing in somebody from Nabisco to run a technology company and not understanding the dependencies that a lot of employees had on the business, and that critical need, if you're going to do cost reductions, to not treat employees like machines you can throw out, but assets that needed to be nurtured. I should point out IBM made a number of mistakes both ways. When they collapsed the printer division, they took the folks that were building printers, they moved them over to accounting. And at that particular point in time, our accounting went to hell in IBM, because people that are working on manufacturing lines, if they liked accounting, they might have gone into it. They did not like accounting, and they were really bad at it. And one of the worst things you can do is an attempt to save jobs, put people in jobs they're not qualified for and they hate, because you won't get a boost in productivity. It'll just exacerbate the underlying problem. So looking at companies that look at people like valuable assets that are making meaningful changes to the problems of diversity and equality, that showcase an environment that is consistent with the customers that they serve, and who don't isolate their executives from both their employees and their customers, are all important steps to finding a company that's unlikely to lay you off, unlikely to treat you badly, and likely to be there if you need them to be there. And that's really goes to the core of decent work, and what we should all strive to provide as managers, and strive to look for as employees.
Thank you. Professor David Schumacher, what's your concluding remarks for today?
Well, excellent contributions by everyone. And once again, I want to build on one part which I heard, which was about the Great Resignation during COVID. So I think that's a good example of people taking decent work into their own hands. Someone said, and forgive me, I forget who said, about people leaving jobs because of toxic bosses. Well, clearly, that's true just from people that I've talked to. Now, I don't know what the numbers are. I don't know how they relate overall. Oh, that was bad. But people did take the ingenuity into their own hands by either moving to another company. I know one person who moved entirely out of their line of work that they'd been doing for the last 10, 15 years and moved into another sector. They had had education that helped them make the move, but COVID was the reason that they did that they took that ingenuity. I know other people that decided that they didn't like what was going on in their current companies, didn't see better opportunities in other companies, so they created their own. So the idea of, Sharif, you mentioned startups, was taking an idea that maybe they'd been sitting on for a while and deciding to pursue that idea in a business of their own, versus staying with the corporate culture or moving to a competitor that maybe his culture wasn't all that different. They went out on their own. So the idea of the stress of COVID forced change, or allowed change, or pushed change, however you want to say it, so that people would try something new. Maybe we can do this by not needing that big push, but by creating the companies that we want, not taking the new company that you build and then eventually turning that into the same toxic environment that you decided to leave earlier. Maybe we can create these as we go. And I think that's something that can be done anywhere. It can be done here in Arizona. It can be done in Malaysia. It can be done anywhere. But it takes a bit of courage to do that. It takes the underlying education to do that, which is, we started talking about that late, but a very important part of producing and allowing for decent work. But I think the ingenuity factor, the entrepreneurial factor, is a way to take the situation into your own hands and to pursue that the way that you think is best. And then you settle the ethics issue that I brought up earlier, at least for yourself and in the domain that you now find yourself operating in. And I'll leave it with that today. Thank you, Sharif.
Thank you. Professor Paul, what's your concluding remarks for today?
Yes, I think, for the individual person in a company, a sense of fairness is very important. And, income inequality, is a huge factor, which just doesn't seem, it doesn't build. There doesn't seem to be anything fair about the enormous inequality. The CEO of a company making hundreds or multiple hundreds times more than an employee in a critical position in the company. So that's one idea. One thing that is important to address the inequality. The what people earn, the earnings inequality, which has gotten a lot worse. With COVID. Obviously, one's job role, the challenges and the variety are very important for maintaining one's interest, because we definitely have these, I call them novelty filters in our brain. And if we do something, we need to have new things happening. So if we do the same old thing all of the time, it can get pretty boring quickly, and then that can collapse productivity in jobs. I think equally important, or maybe even more important, is the big picture of what the company is actually doing. So, even for very large companies, for example, I'll use the example of SpaceX, for example. So, they have these lofty goals, and most of the employees have bought into those lofty goals, and they see going into work each morning as a pleasure, as something that is advancing technology, perhaps bringing humans to other planets, and certainly dropping by orders of magnitude the costs of getting materials up into space. So those companies seem to make breakthroughs continuously, and have the do things that other people have said have been impossible, and completely disrupt an entire industry. In this case being an industry that was dominated just by governments, by space programs within governments. And now we have the individual companies that are producing and making much greater strides into space than any of the government programs, with their sort of enormous contractors, and huge multi-billion-dollar budgets. And here you have a sort of upstart come along, and Tesla is also another good example, Apple. So what the company is doing is very, very important for the initial desire of people coming out of school, with their degrees, to they want to work for a specific type of company. And then once they get there, whether they stay or not, that depends a lot on the culture of the company, which was mentioned. One of the things with companies is, if a company is successful, it's pretty easy to work there, and everybody can be happy and feel productive. It's when the company faces pressures or is not doing so well, then the people, how they deal with that is very important. So, for example, in companies that have a culture where they really don't tolerate people making mistakes, those companies tend to not do very well at all, because mistakes are made, but it's part of human, nature. It's part of the way things work. There's always going to be mistakes. So how the culture of the company that deals with that is very important. If they just fire people over it, sort of knee-jerk reaction, then mistakes are covered up and hidden, and then they'll propagate within the company, and then you have huge problems at the ability to deliver anything with the company. So people should be expected within companies to make mistakes, and it's how the company deals with that is crucial for employee happiness. So, like I said, during very successful times, it's very easy to go with the flow, sort of. It's when there's problems and when there's mistakes made, how those are dealt with. That's very important for it's got to be done correctly for long-term success of the company, and long-term happiness of and availability of good jobs within that company. So thanks, Sharif. Great
Thank
topic
you.
for today.
Thank you. Thank you. This is really great contributions. This week we have debate on climate change. So I know that you have a great interest on climate change. You are a great activist. So those who want to join, even Mr. David Schumacher, want to join in the debate, you can. And beside that, we are taking many more important actions with this developing world, especially our target. We want to promote education because we find that if we promote education, educated group of people, they will change their society. So maybe we cannot change whole world, but we can change human, and human can change their society. That is our aspects, and already we are engaging with uh, many communities in the developing world, interesting things, NGO, hospitals, school, college, mosque, many organizations, they are joining with World Talent Economy Forum, but definitely we need more of our support from our speakers, those who are our board of advisors, and they can guide us and we can move together and help millions of people. And another things, World Talent Economy Forum, definitely we are against any kind of war. So what we are observing in Ukraine, I believe that Russia should stop this kind of initiative. And not only that, I request all of the developed world that war actually not a solution for this world. Definitely not a solution for this world. In this Middle East, in Kashmir, even in Europe's and Africa, what we are observing, this is not solution. So we need to take more humanitarian efforts. I know that developed nations has a lot of asset, a lot of resources. So you can invest in productive things. You can invest in healthcare, educations. You can invest in uh, startup, even some great idea. It can change human life. War definitely not be the solution for this world. So I request all of the politicians, those who taking this kind of initiative, even though I know that American people, they are good, Russian people, they are good, Ukraine people, they are good. It's all about the politics and all of the political nonsense. That's why we are suffering a lot. Maybe Transhumanist Party, they can take the lead in the future uh, for changing this world, changing the political concepts, and we can support you. So this is the way we can be more productive. So talent economy, always think about people, always work for people. So all of your contributions will be helpful for developing world. Thank you, Mr. David Schumacher and Professor Paul, for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. Thank you. Bye bye and take care.